General Michael Hayden was the Director of CIA, Director of NSA, and the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. He currently serves as a principal with the Chertoff Group. Please welcome our S4 keynote speaker, General Michael Hayden.
Thanks for the chance to come chat. I'm going to be very efficient, I hope, with some commentary, because I know you've got a really full schedule. And I thank Dale for the invitation to come down and talk with you. I'm kind of the token liberal arts history major guy to kind of start the event off. I am not going to pretend to dive into technological detail, but what Dale's asked me to come down here to do is to kind of just set with what my Army buddies used to call the big hand little map briefing. All right? The broad policy context within which you're going to have to work your operational and technological miracles, that the broad policy context really matters in this cyber challenge that we all face. So let me just jump in and explain, at least from the policy point of view, why this remains still so very hard to do. So here's a great quote from Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy. He lays it out in as direct and as succinct a manner as I've seen, and I love the back half of this, where he gets the word poison and nourish in the same sentence, talking about the same thing, that it simultaneously both poisons and nourishes us. Now look, you know the background of this, but let me just share with you in a very abbreviated way the executive summary, the way I talk about this to our countrymen when I do trade associations and other groups that you're probably interested in. The first thing I point out is that this is an incredibly disruptive development for the human species. I did something similar to this about 7 years ago out in the ballroom at Caesar's Palace in Vegas. It was for Black Hat, okay? And I'm leaning into the darkness with 3,000 claiming to be reformed hackers as the former director of the National Security Agency. By the way, I can see you. I couldn't see them. The lights were so bright, that was so dark. And I at this point in the presentation, I said, you know, I'm not as expert on this as you guys, but I think this cyber thing's getting traction, okay? So I got polite laughter. But my point to them was, even they, I think, underappreciated how disruptive a technology this is. I played my own Ed McMahon to my own Johnny Carson, all right? And simply said, how big a deal is it, Johnny? And I said, this is as disruptive a development as the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere 500 years ago. And I won't, like I told you, you're getting the executive summary, but I could riff on that for about 10 minutes, showing you the parallel disruption we get out of it. So disruptive for my old world. You know, I'm 39 years at GI. So disruptive that we in the American military think of this as a domain. I mean, we went from land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain. I got taught that down in San Antonio in the late 90s when I became the commander of the Air Intelligence Agency. And my staff, which is really bright and frankly on the leading edge of developing how to think about this, frankly said to me, General, sit down, take out a clean sheet of paper, a number 2 pencil, and write this down. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. And that is now, you can see by the Bill Lynn article reflected there in Foreign Affairs several years ago, that's now American military doctrine. Now, you know as well as I, it differs from the other 4 domains in that this one was man-made. And these are some of the men who made it. That's Vint Cerf, probably a familiar face to most of you. I actually say to civilian audiences, now you know who invented this, right? And I get the usual Vice President Gore answer. And I said, no, it wasn't Al Gore. It was my neighbor. And actually, Vint is my neighbor. He lives in Great Falls. I live in Falls Church. He comes to my classes at George Mason when I'm doing this. It's really kind of a treat. You know, it's the equivalent of the Western Civ teacher being able to say, ladies and gentlemen, a real treat tonight, Christopher Columbus. Okay. Now, Vint is great with my class. I said, hey, Vint, how come this thing is so damn hard to defend? And the short version of his long answer is, well, you know, that really wasn't in the statement of work. Okay. That they had gotten from ARPA, which fundamentally was, how do I move large volumes of data quickly and easily between a limited number of nodes, all of whom I know and all of whom I trust? Then points out, too, that the technology wasn't all that ready for cyber defense. And then in a moment of incredible candor, in a moment of really incredible candor, he says, and Mike, we really didn't know it was going to take off the way it did. Okay? And of course, there you've got today's World Wide Web with the same architectural principle. Quickly and easily, large volumes, nodes known, nodes trusted. And here you've got unlimited number of nodes, most of whom are unknown and a lot of whom don't deserve to be trusted. That's why this is so hard. You know that. What could go wrong? You know what can go wrong. This is my taxonomy that I lay out to those trade associations. All I want to point out to you on this taxonomy is as we move forward in time, the badness is sliding down this chart. If we were doing this 3 or 4 years ago, in fact, if I go back a couple slides, there, Bill Lynn's article, he fundamentally says in this article that it's all about stealing your stuff. Okay? It's still about stealing your stuff. That hasn't diminished, but we are seeing malevolent activity move in the direction of not just theft, but destruction of your stuff, or destruction of the network by which you can use and manipulate your stuff, or then finally, and the one that this conference is focusing on, using activity up here in my thumb, okay, in the cyber domain, to create effects down here in physical space. And until about a month or so ago, I said pretty much the only sole example of that was demonstrated by that picture in the lower right-hand corner. That's Ahmadinejad walking through the centrifuge hall at Natanz prior to 1,000 of those centrifuges being destroyed in a cyber attack. And here are the people who actually do the bad things. We can divide the taxonomy up in multiple ways. You know this. We can have 5, 10, 15 groups. I don't put script kiddies in here. I mean, there are different ways of categorizing this. All I want to point out to you on this slide, not argue about my definition of the groups, but to talk a little bit about the movement within the groups. And this plays directly, I think, to some of the topics that you're focused on. Let's do nation states first, all right? Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former DCIA. Mike McConnell, former DERNZA, former Director of National Intelligence. They do a bit more arm waving about nation-state threats than I do. Leon, in his last year as Secretary of Defense, spent an awful lot of time talking about digital Pearl Harbors, digital 9/11s. The next 9/11 will be a cyber 9/11. One of the last speeches he gave as Secretary of Defense was on the Intrepid up in the Hudson River in New York, in which he said exactly what I just said to you. I don't do that. Okay? Let me come at it from a slightly different way. If the Chinese are turning out the lights on the eastern seaboard, I'm predicting that's not the first item the president's going to get briefed on the next morning. That is going to be a subset of a really ugly global scenario. So I'm not quite concerned about that catastrophic attack out of the blue by the major nation-state actors. I'm more concerned about those other flags up there. And here I'm concerned about, let me describe this for you, the isolated, renegade, sanctioned, nothing to lose, what the hell, let's roll the dice, nation-state, which is a permanent definition of North Korea. And I'm creative enough to imagine circumstances where that would be a current definition of Iran. Imagine the nuclear deal heading south. And I'm even dark enough to imagine a few moments where that actually might be a description of the Russian Federation, too. You know, where they're sanctioned, Putin's got nowhere to turn, the oligarchs are turning on him, he can't give left, he can't give right, he's got to get some relief, and so he tries to reach out and touch to kind of demonstrate, you see, this isn't cost-free. This will come at a price for you. So I'm more concerned about that kind of attack rather than a catastrophic, all the lights east of the Mississippi going dark. Criminal gangs, very familiar with it. I had a wonderful exchange with Yevgeny Kaspersky about criminal gangs. I was doing a talk somewhat like this up in the Reagan Center for Kaspersky America, and I talked about the attacks in Estonia, in Georgia, 07, 08. and I said they were carried out by patriotic Russian hackers. Okay? And I came off stage, and Yevgeny stops me and says, Michael, those weren't patriotic Russian hackers. He said those were Russian criminal gangs. Now, I'm going to summarize his comments to me in my own words, all right? But essentially what Yevgeny pointed out to me was kind of like the first scene in Godfather 1. Remember where the Undertaker is in there during the family wedding, and Don Corleone is kind of holding court in his study, and the Undertaker says, my daughter needs protection, I need a favor, Don Corleone. And Don Corleone says, I will grant you this favor, but I may come to you for a service. Okay? I think what Yevgeny was telling me is these gangs in the post-Soviet space are allowed to do the things they do as long as they do them outward. But every now and again, Don Vladimir will come to them for a service. Now, I got a slide here about the Ukraine about a month ago that might actually illustrate one of those examples. The last group, hacktivists, the change in character there is that more and more of them let me rephrase that. They're not as purely self-organized and ideologically righteous as they formerly were. You recall WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, PayPal. You could contribute to WikiLeaks via PayPal. That goes public. PayPal takes them down. These guys self-organize, go after PayPal. All right? I think that's stupid. I think that's wrong. But it's kind of idealistic. It's kind of self-motivated. More and more, we're seeing these guys in the service of greater causes. More and more, we're seeing these guys in the service of, say, the Iranian state. More and more, we're seeing these guys in the service of the Syrian state, the Syrian Electronic Army, and so on. So we've seen a lot of bad things happen, most of it for profit. Although one in the lower left is puzzling. Going after medical records at Anthem. I see a migration here in terms of theft of data. It used to be stealing data as product. All right? With Anthem, United Airlines, and I'll get to OPM in a minute, it's actually the theft of big data. With whomever's doing this, they're going to go ahead and productize this on their own. They're just stealing big data to have the repositories from which they can then go create whatever their business model is. Remarkable attack. You've got background on this, I'm sure. I tell public audiences those 4 sins I showed you before, stealing your stuff, corrupting your stuff, hammering your network, physical destruction, all 4 of those were present in this attack. At the Chertoff Group, where I now kind of work part of my time in my post-government life, we've talked to the Sony folks. This is tremendously destructive. All right, it stole data, it destroyed data, it destroyed networks, and it came damn close to physical harm. I grew up in Pittsburgh, on the north side there. You know, most frightening thing I heard as a teenager is, I know where you live, and I know what kind of car you drive. And the people at Sony were getting those kinds of notes from the perpetrators of this attack, up to and including, and I know what high school your daughter goes to. And so there was an awful lot of tears in the hall when this took place. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in the narrative here, but I want you to be aware that our government had a hell of a time characterizing this, which kind of gets back to the liberal arts, political science role I'm playing here. President Obama knew this was bad enough that he had to go say something about it. So he did go out in the press room and make a statement about this, recall? He described it as cyber vandalism. I strongly disagree that this is not the digital equivalent of spray painting subway cars in Manhattan. Okay? But I must admit, even I, who criticize the president for his description, have trouble coming up with one that I'm totally comfortable with. What do you call this? And I simply have to tell you that within government, unless you can figure out what to call something, you have a hell of a time figuring out what to do about it. You saw a mirror image of the Sony attack with the Sands Casino. Here it was the Iranians going after the Sands Casino system because the owner, shown there in the lower right, was a very vocal supporter of Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu said some nasty things about the supreme leader, and then you had an incredibly destructive wiping attack. And you know, from my point of view, the The industry most vulnerable to a wiping attack is probably financial services. But frankly, you got to tuck gaming right up there near the top of the stack too, in terms of how bad this was. And then, as I said, the attack on OPM, what is it, 22.4 million records? Probably many of the people in this room, certainly mine. Let me offer you a view on this, though. And I've said this publicly at an event like this the Wall Street Journal was holding. This is not shame on China. This is shame on us. As director of the National Security Agency, if I would have had the ability to steal the Chinese equivalent of this stack of data, I would have done it in a heartbeat. Now here comes the punchline. And I would not have had to have gone downtown to ask anyone's permission. This is how nation states treat one another. So this is not shame on China. This is shame on us for not protecting your information and mine. And then this is the one I alluded to. Now I know you got FireEye coming here tomorrow, the next day. And FireEye, or not FireEye, Eyesight Partners. You've got Eyesight Partners coming. They've been pretty forward-leaning about, they know the butler did it. All right? But I'll be curious to see how that plays out. If the butler did it, all right, if this isn't, by the way, that picture in the right is not that attack. That picture in the right is a result of an attack in November where Ukrainian nationalists physically destroyed power lines going into the Crimea. That's the Crimea. So I can see the plot line here. You know, you do this as a Crimea, watch this. But we'll let the facts take us where they may. If it is, and I've got another example beyond Stuxnet to demonstrate a weapon comprised of ones and zeros creating effects down here in physical space. Now, you may ask, well, okay, Hayden, not bad. It's pretty dangerous out there. How come the government's not doing something about it? And as I said, I got 39 years of government service. Let me just kind of state what should be obvious to you. The government will be permanently late to need in providing cyber security. It has to do with the rapid advance of technology. It has to do with the overall sclerosis of our government. And finally, it has to do with our political culture. It has to do with what does that word that I've bolded there in red mean in the digital age. Put another way, we, the big we, the 325, 330 million we, have not yet decided what it is we want or what it is we will allow our government to do to keep us safe up here in the cyber domain. We get prickly enough down here in physical space. Trust me, I was also director of CIA beyond NSA. We still have arguments about the appropriate role of government here. But we have not even begun to lay the rules, the policy, the legal framework out for what government can or can't do up here. Quick example, I live in McLean, all right, Fairfax County, across the river from DC. I get up of a night, I can't sleep, I look out the window, I see a Fairfax County police car coming by, and he's shining a spotlight on my shrubs. My immediate thought is, my tax dollars at work. I like that. Now, you imagine whatever it is you think the digital equivalent is, and you can't tell me you're happy, because we haven't yet figured that out. Now, it's not that government hasn't done anything, and I'm going to give you 5 or 6 slides here of recent steps where our government's kind of shuffling in the right direction, but without any great speed. We actually got cybersecurity legislation passed this year. I actually didn't think that was likely, but the longer it went on, the more bad things happened. The more you saw the slides I showed earlier, Anthem and Home Depot and so on. We actually got a very modest bill that provides liability protection for companies sharing information with one another or information with the government. Good on us, long time in coming. It took 3 sessions of Congress to get this bill. Back to the government's going to be permanently late to need. The president issued an executive order on the 1st of April in which he said, you know, we're mad as hell and we're probably not going to take it anymore. This pivots off a white paper written by Denny Blair, former Commander, Pacific Command, and former DNI, and John Huntsman, former governor of Utah, former ambassador to China, in which he said, look, the Chinese are eating our lunch up here in the cyber domain, stealing our intellectual property. It's hard for us to respond to them in the cyber domain, rather than telling companies, you really got to button that stuff up. Okay? But they're doing it for profit. So why don't we make it less profitable for the Chinese to do this? In other words, we don't have to respond up here in Hayden's thumb. We can respond down here in physical space with economic measures that are they're well within the reach of the U.S. government. That's what Blair and Huntsman said. That's what the executive order says. So if you steal our intellectual property, we get to say, that bus,
Okay.
damn, that looks like a bus that we used to make in Dearborn, Michigan. I don't think you're going to sell that sucker in North America. Or, I understand you've made great profit from this new design.
Yeah.
Do not expect to allow your stock to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And by the way, you're not getting a visa. And forget about your kids or your money coming to the United States. In other words, we have economic tools to punish cyber behavior. Ash Carter, out at Stanford, probably about 6 months ago now, DoD cyber strategy. He kind of laid out 3 layers of attacks. And here he is trending in the direction of talking about defending industrial control systems. He said that routine attacks need to be fended off by private companies. You're kind of on your own out there. More complex attacks. Okay, more complex attacks, the private sector can and should depend on the Department of Homeland Security for genuine support. Let me decode that for you. You are still on your own for the more complex attacks. But then Carter goes, but there are some attacks so serious that we will actually shoot back. It's the first time we've ever said that. Amy Ziegard, who's a professor out at Stanford, was interviewing the secretary, and she says, well, how bad an attack does it have to be? And that's the quote that he gave. In physical space, we would call that counter battery fire. And I'm out of government now 7 years. For 5.5, I wasn't sure whether or not it was a felony for me to say that we can shoot back. And now you've got the Secretary of Defense not only saying we can shoot back, but actually showing you the circumstances in which that can happen. So that's a good thing, too. Then we get Xi Jinping visiting the United States, and he agrees, at least in writing, to the American definition of what constitutes legitimate cyber espionage. Now, I'm probably not telling you people anything that's news, but you do know we steal other people's stuff in the cyber domain, right? Okay? In fact, as a former director of NSA, I like to think we're number one. Okay? But we steal stuff to keep you free and keep you safe. We do not steal stuff to make you rich. By the way, that makes us an incredibly small minority on the planet. I can think of only 4 other countries who can say those 2 sentences and still have them be true. Usual suspects, they all speak English. They all worked at Bletchley Park at one time or another. Okay? Every other nation state believes it is legitimate espionage activity to steal intellectual property. And the Chinese are the poster child for it. And yet, Xi Jinping makes this statement. Now, I'm skeptical that he will live up to it, but you realize that's the Chinese agreeing to our definition of what is and is not legitimate state activity. Oh, yeah, I understand we got Europeans in the room. Stand by to be boarded. I'm coming after you. So, y'all familiar with the safe harbor decision coming out of the European Court of Justice? You know, the community government had set standards saying, the Americans are cool. You can store your data in the United States. They have adequate privacy protections that meet European standards. That's what we're living under. That was called safe harbor. Then the European Court of Justice, incredibly misinformed about what it is the United States can and can't do, obliterates the kind of hall pass for all the governments to allow their industry to sign up with Google and Microsoft and like companies and be indifferent about where their data is stored, North America or Europe. Now that creates a rush for the door. all the European nations, right, are now in the midst of passing laws that America does not provide adequate safeguards, privacy safeguards for European data. And now you've got this great rush of European companies, in essence, profiting greatly from this European court decision. Now, this is really, by the way, Europe's still a friend. We're good. Okay. But you've got this pathological government structure in Europe. You've got the European Union up here, and you've got the nations down here. And the Union is not responsible for security. Security remains a function at the national level. So what you've got making these kinds of decisions are a bunch of, dare I say, bureaucrats whose responsibilities deal with privacy and commerce and not security. Now, we got that issue too, but we don't separate privacy, commerce, and security in different governments. We have our knife fights internally and decide on a way ahead. It's really hard work, it's ugly at times, but but at least we do it all within the same room. You've got the Europeans up here at the union level, so this is Brussels, making this kind of decision, okay, saying, yeah, the Americans are unsafe, don't put your stuff there. While the Europeans who are responsible for security, they're not in Brussels, they're in Paris, they're in London, they're in Berlin. They're passing laws that would never see the light of day in the United States of America when it comes to what governments can do to personal identifiable information. I was on Morning Joe about 6 months ago. That's probably longer. It was after Charlie Hebdo. And the French then immediately passed legislation giving the French services more invasive privileges going into databases and ISPs and so on. And Scarborough says to me, well, General, it looks like that's the French equivalent of the Patriot Act. And I just started laughing on set. I said, you got to be kidding me. This is so far beyond the Patriot Act that it's off the scale. So you've got the French recently allowing DGSE and DST more entree. You've got the British allowing GCHQ more entree. For God's sake, you've got the Germans, okay, imposing data retention laws on their ISPs. None of that would survive here. Okay, I feel better now. Thank you for that 5 minutes that allowed me to vent. Good. So you don't think I'm just a reflexive right-wing wingnut up here. Let me give you my view on encryption. I disagree with Jim Comey. I actually think end-to-end encryption is good for America. And I know it represents particular challenges for the FBI, but on balance, I actually think it creates greater security for the American nation than the alternative being the back door, the side door, the dual key, and so on. I actually think I can win that on security grounds, okay? I just think America is more secure with X than it is with Y. But I don't have to, right? I could just win it on practical grounds. When was the last time you saw the success of legislation designed to prevent technological progress? All right? It's just not going to happen. Which kind of brings me to an interesting point. I just took maybe 30, 35 minutes of your life talking about government this, government that, and you need to understand the policy and the law, and it's really hard, and I'm sorry. I actually think government is not the main player here. I actually think that the private sector is actually, look, I told you I was in government 4 decades, all right? When our Department of Defense issues an operational order, there's a paragraph in there that says, you are the supported command, and you are the supporting commands. So you kind of know where your main effort is. In the American Civil War, you'd have Grant or Lee writing an operational order saying, your corps is the main body, and you, sirs, you will conform the movements of your corps to the movements of the main body. Okay? While I was in government, I was convinced that the main body for cybersecurity was the government of the United States. And the supporting arms were you guys. I am now convinced I had that backwards. The main body, when it comes to cybersecurity, in all but a very small fraction of cases, the main body is the private sector. And the government needs to think a lot more about conforming its movements to the movements of the main body. At a minimum, that means removing legal and policy impediments to your doing things that are well within your technological reach. So I've got some familiar faces up there. You see Sergey Brin, you got the Facebook guy. I saw the movie, I got background here. Lower left, just use this as an example. That's Uber, right? In how many cities has the existing political structure fought Uber tooth and nail to protect vested interests? And how many times have they won? It's what my Navy buddies used to call a round number. In other words, it's the technology that's driving the policy and political change, not the other way around. And that's, good, bad, indifferent, I don't know. It is. It's kind of a state of nature. Lower right, we've seen this movie before. Okay? More than 100 years ago, about 150 years ago, we ribboned this continent with railroads. And for the first time, domestic commerce went from being local to being continental. And because of that technological movement, the private sector drove cultural, political, and legal change. Number one, the Interstate Commerce Commission is a product of the American railroads. You don't have that because you don't need it before the railroads do what they have to do. One final example on this, because I think it really drives home the point. What time is it? It's 10 to 10, Eastern Standard Time. Where'd that come from? We tell time based upon the need of the railroads to not allow every damn village and town in North America to tell you when it's noon. You just can't run a complex organization without dividing the country into time zones. Sorry, too far of an historical digression. I'm just trying to make the point that very often it is most productive for policy and law to follow technology rather than to twist it in the other direction. I actually think that people like I've shown you on this picture will have more influence over the way we go forward than the American Congress. What those guys define as legitimate privacy will have a greater impact on our cultural understanding of privacy in the digital age than anything Congress will do. One final wrinkle on this. I've been talking nationally, except for mistreating the Europeans unfairly a bit. This is a global question. So let me throw this quote up here from Walter Russell Mead, a great American political scientist. Okay? And he is talking about the web here. Okay? And by the way, in another version of this, for different kinds of audiences, I talk about the elegance of the web, and I go back to Vince Cerf and the guys at Stanford, and I build the web through history, and I show the sky darkening with all the lines that are now connected. And I then point out that this thing is certainly quintessentially Western, and in some ways quintessentially American. Okay? Technologically elegant, done by the private sector, emphasizing Western values like, this thing is ubiquitous, unitary, accessible, free. I tell audiences, we're doing this in the Jackie Gleason Theater in the year 2426, and I say something like the Americans, someone in the back row is going to go, Americans. Oh, yeah, the internet guys. We're going to be remembered for this the way the Romans are remembered for their roads. Okay? And so it represents, I think, quintessential Western values. Here's Freedom House's scorecard put out not more than a few weeks ago as to how the rest of the world respects those quintessential Western values when it comes to governance of the web. Now again, I think it's a losing hand for the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Saudis, and others to try to limit, to disestablish what God hath wrought here in terms of a global, ubiquitous, accessible, unitary, identical web. But you've got nation states that are really going at it, trying to, frankly, not make the web more safe, but to undercut the first reason we had for creating it in the first place. Look at this. This is a Russian-Chinese cybersecurity document. Let me summarize. Their definition of cybersecurity is trying to prevent why we built the thing in the first place. And so I guess the great catchphrase that I'd put to you is, as we go about making this thing more secure, be careful. Do not create tools or policies or legitimacies for those who will use these things not to make the web more safe, but to destroy why we have it there at all. And that last piece makes that law, policy, political, cultural question even more complex than I've been allowing myself to make it for the last 35 minutes. By the way, I love that new Maslow hierarchy of needs, don't you? So I know you've got a lot on your agenda. I thank you for the opportunity to come and share a few policy, legal thoughts as to where we are. If you take anything away from this, it is the message that I try to emphasize near the end. You are the main body. You're the ones who are going to determine whether we win or lose. This is, it may be good and may be bad, but this is a private sector fight largely. And so I wish you great success, not just in the next couple of days, but in your work in the days, weeks, and years ahead. Thanks very much.